Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest is David Ray, the Chief Technologist at Micro Focus Government Solutions. Now, David, before break, we were talking about this idea of the working capital funds and agencies getting started, and we talked about some quick wins, like around software asset management, reducing the numbers of software that they're paying for. But that brings us down, I think, a good path of this idea of cost savings versus cost avoidance. So many times when I hear agencies talk, they really are talking avoidance, not savings. What you're proposing in many ways is saying, no, they need to focus on the savings aspect, because then they can use the money for other projects that maybe will be further down the road of cost avoidance, but that savings needs to be done up front.
Yes, I think that serves two purposes when you get started initially. You're going to want to fund the things that are going to help you, one, pay back the money you borrowed, and two, fill your piggy bank full of working capital money that you can use for some of the harder to execute initiatives which optimize IT and also reduce cost, or avoid cost. Things like your predictive analytics tools, some of your security analytics, being able to do some of the business process automation so you can streamline your remediation of security instances. These are all things we desperately need to do. But if you only do those things, you're not going to realize that cost until the out years, in which you can then show that you didn't spend the money. Therefore, you can recoup the cost and put it in the working capital fund. So I think there's going to be an initial push to pick projects where you can identify quantifiable savings. And a quantifiable savings is you can kill contract, you can utilize less power, you can eliminate labor, or eliminate an application or several applications, which then eliminates people, process, labor, and cost. And additionally, in the out years, you're avoiding cost as well. So I do think initially I would be selecting those projects where it's easy to identify the savings. The other thing is at least in the 20 years I've been involved with the federal government, they're notoriously pretty bad at managing cost. If you're going to try and generate savings, you first have to understand how to manage cost. And that's going to be very difficult for agencies that have always been in this mode of you spend everything you have and that money saved is money lost, to a mode in which I can now, actually, if I save money, I'll have more working capital to spend. So it's actually running IT like a business, and it's empowering the federal CIO to be able to do that. So yes, I do think there'll be a hybrid approach there, but initially they're going to get started on things that generate cost savings quickly.
The benchmarking piece I definitely want to go back to, but before I do that, one of the things you mentioned was the cost avoidance versus cost savings, and this focus tends to be on cost avoidance. And we saw that with the OMB guidance too. They talked a lot about cost avoidance. Do you think that's just because they don't have that baseline?
I do think that's part of it. I don't know if OMB and GSA actually realize that agencies don't have the lower level detail of cost management. What most agencies do is they flow funds to contracts. They flow funds to programs. They don't actually manage the execution of the project, which is required for you to keep track and to manage where savings will be. So the sense of savings is killing a contract is a way to generate some savings. And it's easier to do that when you're looking at your service contracts, your software license contracts, your asset management contracts initially. But eventually, if you're going to try and save money and avoid cost, you have to start managing activities and how IT is executing work. I mean, there's only three types of work, right? There's planned work, there's work in process, and there's unplanned work. And cost avoidance is eliminating unplanned work, which is death to IT. And that's where most of the cost is today. So you eventually want to get there. I just don't think you can start there if you want to populate your working capital fund with for future innovation projects.
All right, David, I'm going to put on my cynical reporter's hat for a second. Wait a minute, we have a vendor saying they want to kill contracts. Isn't that bad for you?
It certainly is. I put on my citizen hat when I sit in this booth. I try not to put on my vendor hat. However, I will say, we have some world-class, tools around IT management and efficiencies, including tools that can avoid cost. I just think it's about looking at that IT portfolio and actually focusing on portfolio management and putting some value measurement criteria together so you can pick the low-risk, high-value projects and get those funded, as well as work towards the longer, much needed IT modernization goals to improving cyber and cybersecurity.
Well, I think the agencies will be happy to hear that you wear your citizen hat when you are when we're talking about this stuff, because a lot of times cutting contracts is not a very popular thing. Cutting people is not a very popular thing, and I think agencies spend so much money on people and contracts. There's not a lot of, well, where do you want me to cut the fat? I think a lot of times it's said, but you make a great point that you have to understand where the fat is to be able to cut it, and that actually takes us down the path of understanding the value of the IT and the cost. So technology business management, TBM. In fact, just recently I did an interview with a former deputy CIO over at GSA who talked a lot about TBM. What are you seeing? Are agencies starting to pull in TBM? They were told last year under the Capital Planning Investment Control, but a process to use TBM, but it's a tough road for a lot of agencies.
It's funny. I've seen several agencies that have started, implementing TBM. However, I don't think they have the cost measurements at a low enough level in the organization to be able to aggregate costs by the Federal Cost Commission's cost categories. So I think that's a little misunderstanding that a lot of agencies have, is that it's really about tracking activities and tracking cost, which requires tracking in most agencies, the largest piece of that cost is on operational spend. In fact, in most agencies, as everyone knows, it's close to 70% of their IT budget is on operational spend. So when you look at your IT portfolio, the best place to focus on cost savings is on that operational spend initially, not the DME funding or your modernization funding initially, because that's typically a very small amount of the portfolio. So how do you cut back on the operational spend? And that's where a lot of the automation orchestration tools and some of the goals that are centered around the data center optimization initiative that you can implement will help avoid some of that cost and reduce some of that long-term operational spend. But you need the cost controls in place. You can't just start aggregating the cost you're spending on contracts and people to get to TBM. It's a much harder problem to solve. It's about putting activity-based costing in place and time management in place, so you understand what your contractors are working on, as well as your full-time employees within an agency towards a capability or a goal. It's not a very easy thing to do.
And I think a lot of agencies see this also as another unfunded mandate, which could be, I think you and I could probably talk a whole different discussion on that. The challenge where, okay, you want me to do this, but I really don't have the money for it. But here's a way maybe to find some money too. A TBM project, I'm sure if you would be a good sell to internally, but also externally to the fund, to the board as well. The other related to this, you brought up portfolio and project management several times. I think you believe that the agencies will need to set up something that's a little different type of project and portfolio management than maybe we've seen in the past.
That's correct. Most of the project portfolio management tools, when you mention that in a federal environment, the conversation immediately moves towards budget formulation and planning and CIPIC. Those are not portfolio management tools. A true portfolio management tool allows you to optimize your portfolio based on multiple perspectives that you're looking at, not just financial. And that's truly what is going to be needed for IT modernization and aligning it towards your strategic objectives as well as your mission objectives, and then being able to explain to the mission how IT is delivering value to the mission, I think is going to become more and more important as you start modernizing IT, especially when you start rationalizing IT. And most of the portfolio management tools today can help you do both of those. So they help you select the right projects, but then they can also help you track execution of those projects. So it's helping you select the right things, and it's also helping you make sure you're executing those things well. And that's where the project management and the program management section of portfolio management come into play. Most of that is being managed through the FAR on contractors today. The agencies themselves aren't typically executing against that, but I think it'll be very different for the working capital fund type projects. You'll have to get into that cost management, into the actual scope, project schedule, earn value, to make sure you're on track, which may not be very popular for people that think they can move to Agile. Then maybe I know we talked about that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and actually, as soon as you said, cost schedule performance, I said, oh no, not EVM, earned value management. But you think that definitely plays a role. It's not just for the waterfall projects. As agencies move to Agile, iterative development, DevOps, whatever you're going to call it, EVM can still play a very important role.
Well, first off, it's federal law. Okay, so you can't ignore the FAR. And secondly, how you execute a project, your work pattern, has nothing to do with how you budget and plan for a project. You have to do both in the federal space. So you're going to need a hybrid approach where you allocate money for a work stream, but you may execute that work stream in an agile fashion, which is fine using agile tools. But you still need to manage it as a hybrid project so you can report back on the value of the money that is being spent and your progress towards a capability, which is very important. And of course, the progress towards cost savings. You can't do that without cost management. It's simply impossible.
Do you get a sense that there's a push against EVM? Have you had that with conversation with agencies where they don't want to use it anymore, or they think they don't have to use it?
Well,
or
if you talk to any senior official in an agency, they'll tell you they are doing EVM. From a practical standpoint, when you look at what they're doing, they're tracking it at a contract level.
Which is what you're saying is you have to track it at the project level.
You actually have to go to the milestone, to the capability level, if you want to try and manage cost in a timely fashion. Otherwise, you're only managing towards a project as a whole, as a capability as a whole, not the individual iterative capabilities that are required. So it's actually a great tool to use when you're rolling something out, especially an agile project, because your capability level is defined at a budget level within your hybrid project, but the execution is done in a work pattern which may be many epics or user stories which are driving towards iterative capability, but it's all driving back towards some budget goal that was in place and established, and you can track on value towards that.
David, this has been a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. Before I let you go, what's the takeaway from our conversation? What's the 1, 2, 3 things that agencies either should make sure they do as they start looking at the working capital fund, or what are some maybe typical potholes that you're seeing agencies step into that they need to avoid?
Sure. The first is pick the right projects, and I think we talked about that. And the second is make sure you have governance, risk, and compliance in place. And that's one of the potholes you want to avoid. If you don't have that in place, you may not even get funding for your project to start with the Technology Management Board, because they're specifically going to make sure that these are well-run initiatives. And then don't forget, these are joint projects. You're not going to be able to take the money and run off and do what you want with it just because you can reprogram. All those reprogramming steps are going to have to be done in concert with the Technology Management Board. And you're going to have to expose a lot of that governance, risk, and compliance tracking that you're doing with the board so that they can then help you be successful and also help make sure that the fund survives, as the global fund that they're trying to manage.
Let me put a finer point, because one of the things you're talking about is the management of the board. Now, that's the central fund, and then if an agency has their own working capital fund, they still have to answer to OMB and answer those same questions I think you're talking about, which is what's your governance, how are you managing risk, how are you complying not just with the FAR or with cybersecurity, but all the other kind of rules and regulations that come with these projects.
Absolutely. You have to explain that before they'll give you the money. And then once you have the money, every quarter you're going to have to provide them, some status updates. And it'll basically, you have to be a lot more transparent. And then any reprogramming efforts are also going to have to be approved, by the board. So one of the questions I think a lot of us have is how much compliance are they going to actually introduce, and is it going to be more work and more effort than it's worth? And the answers we've gotten back is absolutely not. They're going to try and change the model so that OMB and GSA are going to help agencies, achieve those savings together. They're going to work in concert. So that's the hope here.
Excellent. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Let me thank my guest, David Ray, the Chief Technologist at Micro Focus Government Solutions. David, thank you so much for the time today.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
You've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search innovation.